As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the White House on Thursday asked Congress to approve a $40 billion bill that includes nearly $24 billion for additional spending on the war in Ukraine. So according to CNN, the $24 billion for the Ukraine war includes $13 billion in military aid, $7.3 billion in economic and humanitarian assistance, and it also includes $3.3 billion for infrastructure projects for regional countries impacted by the war, which is kind of a strange addition there. You know, those are countries neighboring Ukraine, I guess. And this request comes after there was a poll from CNN that found 55% of Americans are against more spending on the war in Ukraine. That opinion doesn't matter. They want to go full steam ahead on funding this proxy war against Russia. And so the bill is for $40 billion in total because they're trying to lump in some other things with it, including $12 billion for domestic disaster relief and $4 billion for border security. They probably threw some of that in there to get Republicans on board, So this is an article kind of about how the people in Ukraine are feeling right now, which doesn't matter much to Washington. So according to the Washington Post, the citizens of Ukraine are beginning to adopt a darker mood about the war, and national unity is starting to fray. The change in sentiment among Ukrainians comes as Kiev's spring counteroffensive has failed to retake territory, and casualties are surging. So one Ukrainian that the Washington Post spoke with, Alla Blizniak, said, quote, "Ukrainians, much in need of good news, are simply not getting any. Before, people were united. Now there's a collective sense of disappointment," end quote. So the sense of despair is driven by massive casualties in Kiev's counteroffensive. Blizniak said that most soldiers sent to the front die in just 2 to 3 days. Last week, Politico reported that Kiev has committed 150,000 troops to fight along 3 fronts. Nevertheless, the Pentagon admits that Ukrainian forces have failed to make any significant gains. ECOWAS activates force for Niger intervention. So the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, on Thursday ordered the activation and deployment of a reserve force to restore constitutional order in the Republic of Niger, while also saying that it would seek peaceful means to restore Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum. So after the summit, Alassane Ouattara, who's the president of Cote d'Ivoire, which is the Ivory Coast, he said the West African bloc agreed to launch an intervention as soon as possible and said that his country would provide a battalion of 850 to 1,100 soldiers. So the ECOWAS summit in Nigeria came a few days after the August 6th deadline that the West African bloc gave Niger's junta to reinstate Bazoum. In the statement ordering the activation of the standby force, ECOWAS Commission President, it was the president of the ECOWAS Commission, not the current chair of ECOWAS, which is the Nigerian president. So the commission president said that the bloc would keep all options on the table for the peaceful resolution, but they're saying that they're activating this force for a military intervention. And Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, who again is the chair of ECOWAS, he threatened force, but as a last resort. So kind of sending mixed signals, saying that they're still going to try peaceful resolutions, but there's no sign that the junta is backing down in the face of sanctions and these threats, and they're saying that they're activating this force. It's unclear right now how long it's going to take to activate this reserve force, and if they're really trying, negotiations in the meantime. Here, the Niger junta told Victoria Nuland that they would kill Bazoum if there is a military intervention. So the Associated Press reported on Thursday that the Niger junta told acting Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland that they would kill deposed President Mohamed Bazoum if neighboring countries launched a military intervention to reinstate him. So after meeting with the junta leaders in Niger on Monday, Nuland did not mention this threat, and she did not discuss the possibility of military intervention, but she described the talks. She sounded very negative. She said the talks were extremely frank and difficult, and she sounded very doubtful that the junta would relinquish power. So the U.S. and Iran have reached a deal that will free 5 Americans in exchange for the U.S. releasing some Iranians and granting Tehran limited access to $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds. So sources told the New York Times that the negotiations had been going on quietly for 2 years. So prisoner exchanges have typically been kept separate from other issues between the U.S. and Iran. There's been prisoner swaps. The Trump administration did a prisoner swap with them even after they pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. So as part of the first step in this agreement, Iran has released 5 Iranian-American dual citizens from prison. They put them on house arrest at a hotel where they're going to spend a few weeks before flying to the U.S. and most of them were jailed over spying allegations. So the White House confirmed in a statement that the 5 Americans were released on house arrest, but the Times said that the Biden administration has declined to confirm what Iran will get in return. Sources told the paper that the U.S. has agreed to release several Iranians who were arrested for alleged sanctions violations, which is kind of crazy to me that they arrest people for, put them in jail for violating sanctions. I mean, it's not just a fine. So Iran will only be able to access these funds to pay for humanitarian goods such as medicine and food. So tensions have been soaring between the U.S. and Iran in the Persian Gulf, as I've been covering the U.S. military buildup there. 3,000 U.S. Navy sailors and Marines just showed up. These tensions over these oil tanker seizures that really, the current round of tensions started when the U.S. seized an Iranian oil tanker and forced it to go to the U.S. It wasn't an Iranian oil tanker. It was a tanker carrying Iranian oil that was headed to China. The U.S. made them go to the U.S. And they want to take the cargo. So this, is a sign that hopefully, there's still room for diplomacy. It's good to know at least that there's been some dialogue between the two countries. And if you remember earlier in the year, there was a series of media reports saying that the U.S. and Iran were engaged in negotiations on some sort of interim nuclear deal, but that never materialized into an agreement. And it's interesting. This is something I should try to follow up on. So Robert Malley, who was President Biden's special envoy for Iran, there was a report saying he was meeting directly with Iranian officials in the United States, with Iran's representative to the UN in New York, which, the U.S. and Iran haven't done that. And then after those reports came out, Malley was suspended, supposedly for handling of classified documents or something. I forget exactly what, but it's just kind of odd timing. So he might have made some people angry for doing that.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
Hey, today the big news in America was the inflation numbers came out, and they weren't as bad as they thought. The street only guessed 3.3% rise, but they came in at a lot lower, 3.2% in July. Who the fuck are you talking to? 0.1%. Oh, and these are bullshit numbers, by the way. Oh, don't believe me. Go to Shadow Stats. Yeah, they rigged the numbers so they wouldn't have to pay more in Social Security and could keep pretending that the economy was doing okay. So these numbers are nothing more than pure bullshit from the markets today. No, they were way up when the numbers came out, but they didn't close up that much anymore. And oil prices went down a little bit. Gold's still down. And it's August, and people don't have a fucking clue what's going on. So here's what they reported. Annual inflation slowed more than expected, a welcome sign for consumers. You know what that is? Bullshit. Who have been grappling with high costs. Oh, now everything is okay. You've been grappling with high costs, and now the numbers didn't come in that high. Hey, fuckface, how about everything that went up? How about autos? What it cost? How about what it cost to buy a house, to rent an apartment? On and on and on. While July's annual inflation was higher than June, it's still a sizable drop from the 8.5% reading 1 year ago. You ready? Nearly all of the monthly inflation came from shelter costs. Shelter costs? Who the fuck are you talking to? Shelter costs. Oh, you mean shelters for homeless? That's what they call when you used to own a home. Now it's a shelter. Renting an apartment, that's a shelter. This is the fucking bureaucrats that throw this shit out that they teach you to swallow in kindergarten. Time to take a nap. Okay, yeah, I'm not tired, but I'll take a nap. You told me to. And it keeps fucking going on. Shelter costs. Go fuck yourself. You go to your Trends Journal this week. Credit card debt off the fucking charts. Defaults going on and on and on. All this is nothing more than mainstream. So here you go. Increases. Motor vehicle insurance. Hey, what did we say about insurance going up? No, that's only up 17%. Oh, but butter went down 1.1%. Food from vending machines. Who the fuck would eat food from vending machines? Well, the people in blimpitis. That went up 14%. Motor vehicle maintenance repairs. Hey, there's a guy. This is the fucking fat fuck that wants to steal more of our money and saying how we have to fight in Ukraine. When this fucking guy, they wouldn't make a paper bag big enough to put him in to fight out of. That's Chris Christie, the scumbag from New Jersey. What exit? Well, that fucking guy, it's any exit you turn off, you'll see him. Anyway, motor vehicle, we've been saying this. How long have I been saying all this insurance costs are going up? Frozen fruits and vegetables. What are you eating fucking frozen shit for? That went up 11%, 11.8. Leased cars, 10%. White bread. Ugh. 10.7%. Sugar and sweets, 8.9%. Rent and primary residence, 8%. But televisions went down 10.9%. And major appliances, 9.9%. Who gives a fuck about that? Again, the prices went way up. They went way up. They're not coming down that much. You ready? CNBC. 2023 rents in Manhattan hit a new high in July. The average monthly rent was $5,588, up 9% over last year. Isn't that great? So as traders expect the central bank to cut interest rates multiple times in 2024. No shit. They do it all the time. It's the presidential reality show, and you've got to be a fucking stupid moron to see who's running the show and that they're not in control. This is the current Fed head. The former Fed head, Yellen, is our Treasury Secretary. I mean, could you believe this, Ms. Facha Ruth? Oh, you people tell me watch your language. Fuck you. Fuck you. Swallow their proper bullshit. Get this in your head. When you're in the fight for your life, there is no proper language that you use. The proper language is, don't fuck with me. You got it? And all you little clowns up there, where the fuck were you for the peace rallies? How come you're not putting your money where your heart and mouth is? Private equity offers discount fees as deal-making drought deters investors. Deal-making drought. Fucking no deal-making drought. The scumbags, the fucks that brought those interest rates down to zero to fight the COVID war, allowed the bigs to get bigger and all these deals made, buying up everything, as we wrote about continually. And you had merger and acquisition at an all-time fucking high in 2021. Yeah. Wonder why it can't come up with more dough. You know why I'm so upset? Because I'm an American patriot. And I love this country, and it breaks my heart to see how it's being destroyed in front of our eyes. Is America corrupt? From scandals to systems evaluating government corruption in 2022. The countries most corrupt, they rate Mexico. Right there with them, tied, the United States. 74% of the people say it's a corrupt country. You got it. Oh, Russia doesn't even come in here. Biden asked Congress for additional $24 billion to spend on Ukraine war. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? The U.S. beefs up its military presence in the Gulf in the wake of confrontations with Iran. Yep. This week, the U.S. beefed up its presence by sending more than 3,000 troops and soldiers on 2 warships. And then Iran commented, what do the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Indian Ocean have to do with America? What is your business being here? Iranian Armed Forces spokesman, Brigadier General, whoever his name is, Shekarachki, said this week over the U.S. buildup. He's 100% right. What the fuck are we doing over there? What if Iran was down the Gulf of Mexico? What if China was off the coast of California and Russia's going up and down the coast of New York? Oh my God, how could we allow that? What the fuck are we doing over there? I'll tell you what the fuck we're doing over there. We got demonic, evil people running and ruining the world.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
There really are neocons out there who really still think that was a good idea.
Well, neocons think that some British Tories do, but I think in the case of the neocons, it may reflect their anger at the Nazis in World War II, which they typically read back into World War I or the Franco-Prussian War or maybe the Napoleonic Wars. And Matt Continetti echoes their sentiment. There was a piece I remember a few years ago by not Jacob Siegel, his father. Jacob Siegel's the one who attacked me in Tablet, Fred Siegel, going after Mencken for being on the side of Germany in World War I after knowing that the Kaiser was going to invade the United States in 1909 or some date like that, because the Germans had contingency war plans, as did all the belligerents on both sides, as did the United States. So they thought they were going to act on this to invade the United. But their view of World War I is that it's sort of a prelude to the final solution or something like that. What I thought was remarkable was the moronic treatment of America First, which was associated with the far right. Most members of America First were on the political left. They were not on the right. But there is this myth within the liberal establishment, which the neocons took over, that Well, Charles Lindbergh was sort of a conservative, but others like Wheeler, Bora, Chester Bowles,
Hamilton Fish,
who was an early civil rights leader, were clearly not on the right. They just were upset about America's being pushed into World War I, which turned out so badly.
But also, I don't know the political views for sure of somebody like E.E. Cummings or Sinclair Lewis, but I can't imagine they were super right-wing. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, they were not. And there is a lot of scholarship, for instance, Wayne Cole's book and a lot of work done by Justice Donaghy discussing the politics of the American. This is known. If you go on Wikipedia, you get every kind of American left liberal lie at America First, as you do about McCarthyism, which is something else I'd point to. And in this respect, the woke left simply is taking over the tradition from the older left, the anti-communist left, which saw McCarthy as at least as bad as Hitler, and also violently attacked the America First movement. I suppose the communists would not be that critical because the Soviets were in alliance with the Nazis during the period that the America First movement was operating in the United States.
Incidentally, on this question of McCarthy, I remember for years and years being told that Stan Evans, M. Stanton Evans, was working on his big masterpiece on that subject. Then it finally came out. But I had heard over and over, he's working on it. He's going to definitively establish what really happened and what the rights and wrongs were and so on. It's a huge book, and I have not myself read it. I don't know if you have, and maybe I'm putting you on the spot and asking you this question, but do you know if he was merely summarizing information that was generally available for anybody who actually bothered to look, or did he really dig up new things we more or less hadn't known before?
Oh, no. It is a carefully documented work that shows original research. For instance, I thought I read just about everything on the subject, but then he discusses McCarthy's accusations against the Fort Monmouth, the Communist Front, and there really were people there who were openly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and in that military base. He may have exaggerated the extent to this, but where there was smoke, there was usually fire in the accusations that he made, even if one can deplore his drinking habits or histrionics, which, by the way, Stan Evans tries to show that his vices have been somewhat exaggerated. But most of his accusations were justified, and particularly when it came to security clearance. So the thing that really upsets me is how the woke left, which has turned America into a totalitarian society, are complaining about McCarthyism as being much worse. It was not much worse. There was far less thought control in the 1950s than we're experiencing right now. The government was not as intrusive as it is now. And most universities remained on the left throughout the McCarthy period. And there were lots of people attacking him throughout this period. You were not invited to certain parties, or you did not count socially unless you published something attacking Joe McCarthy. The late Will Herberg wrote something on this at a time when he was still a social democrat, pointing out that the uproar against McCarthy seems to be much worse than anything McCarthy was doing. And I think that's true.
Just a couple of small things. I mean, referring to Chesterton and Belloc as Anglo-Catholics.
Right.
You may think that's a small detail, but that reveals a lack of learning. That the term Anglo-Catholic doesn't mean they're Catholics who live in England. Anglo-Catholic is a term used to describe a movement within the Church of England.
Right.
Where they have theological views that are closer to Catholicism. That's what that is. That's not, so they're not Anglo-Catholics. That was one thing. Also, I expect very little from the left when it comes to summarizing what my intellectual influences have had to say. But the same goes true for neocons trying to describe them. So even, I think on some level, Continetti knows he's supposed to at least grudgingly appreciate somebody like Ludwig von Mises, even though he was very harsh and uncompromising compared to the real-world, nuanced Milton Friedman. But nevertheless, he tries to summarize Mises' argument. Now, Mises' argument about why a socialist central planner can't accomplish his task is that there aren't any prices in the means of production. So therefore, you literally cannot economize because you can't make a choice between one course of action and another, one production process and another, because there's no common unit to compare them. So you don't know if you're wasting resources, if you're doing well, if you're doing badly. There's no way to know. And his summary of this is Mises thought that nobody could account for all the variables in an economy. That is not his point. Mises said, even if you could account for all the variables, if you don't have a common unit to judge different courses of action, all that knowledge about the different variables doesn't do you any good. So that's one. So he hasn't read that. Then also saying that Ronald Reagan was reading Mises in college when Mises had not been translated into English by then. And much as I can respect Ronald Reagan on some levels, I am doubtful about his foreign language skills, Paul. I am not one of these Vox Populi, Vox Dei people. I think the masses are equally to blame for the situation that we're in. But at the same time, if I had to choose between the gender studies department at some university and 100 people chosen from the next town over, that's not a problem for me at all. And also, I do think that on some of the big issues that we're very deliberately and not coincidentally not really supposed to argue about, namely foreign policy, you can argue about it, but only within certain parameters. You can argue about the Supreme Court a little bit, but we all understand that the job of it is to carry on the social revolution through other means. the masses tend to be better on those sorts of things. They tend to be better on social policy, I think. It's harder to trick them into falling for dumb guy gender theory. And so I can see arguments on both sides. I do not see the argument for an enlightened elite needs to run society, because in almost every case, the enlightened elite that identifies itself and then puts itself in that position is always unworthy of it.
Someone sent me a clip from Joe Rogan's podcast where he and Joe were talking about me, and Jordan seemed to be talking about me as like a cautionary tale, like look what can happen to somebody. And Joe said something like, "Oh, I still have hope for Sam." And they're, in my view, they're in this contrarian echo chamber, right? Where, you know, mRNA vaccines are terrifying. COVID was no big deal. January 6th was maybe a non-event, right? The libtards are trying to ruin everything. And there's a whole picture.
We're at least living in the same world as like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. You know what I mean? And then there's people like Sam Harris who somehow are still off in this other world. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't understand how they're there. You know, I don't get it. And I know he clearly doesn't understand why we're here. But so when you try to kind of work through these things, it's funny that from their perspective, it's kind of like, oh, you guys were broken by COVID. And we're like, no, you were broken by COVID. And it is somewhat interesting to see how the people in our world, like I'll go hang out with Joe Rogan and he just looks great and he's happy and he's in great shape. And he's like, dude, I opened this comedy club. It's the biggest comedy club in the city. Oh, we're doing this with the podcast. We're doing this. Everything's great. I'm going to hit the gym. I'll meet you later. We'll get lunch. Then we'll go do shows. It's like this great thing. And everyone in that other world looks like they're shriveled up and dying. It does kind of add to the idea that we're not the ones who were broken. But in the world we're living in, we're like, oh, wow, it's pretty much concluded that the entire response to COVID was wrong. That all of the scientific evidence points toward lockdowns doing basically nothing to mitigate the virus, yet causing all of these other, you know, like horrible outcomes. That the vaccine was not at all what they sold it to us as, that they were lying, that there was all types of shady things going on, that there were mass censorship campaigns against people who were telling the truth while the establishment were perpetrating these lies. That seems so obvious to us. But they're existing in a world where like, nope, we did it all right. It's kind of baffling to see.
Ukraine is the undercard. It's the undercard because the Chinese, who are funding the Russian aggression against Ukraine, are watching. And if we cut and run on Ukraine, the next fight is going to be in Taiwan. And there, it's not going to be us just supplying weapons. It's going to be American men and women who are going to be sent 3/4 of the way around the world to fight there. And they're going to have to fight there not only to protect the freedom of Taiwan, but for those who don't care about that, be practical. 2/3 of the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. Everything that runs our cell phones, our computers, our automobiles, and just about every other element of American life now will be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
I don't think let's pause right here. So if you didn't catch that, Chris Christie has just come back from Ukraine. They had a reinforced airplane, I guess, that was strong enough to carry him over there. And this is now his justification for why we must support the war in Ukraine, because this is the undercard, and we're getting ready for the main event. This to me is one of the most hilarious defenses for the war in Ukraine. You see, we got to fight this war because of this other war, which, mind you, has not started yet, but is just going to. Just take that as a given. It's going to. China will be invading Taiwan. And when that happens, by the way, we're not just sending weapons. We're sending U.S. military. This is going to be a direct war with China. We're going to war with China. And so the only way to stop us from going to war with China is to go to war with Russia in Ukraine. You got that, Rob? That is actually their defense for this war. Let that settle in for a second. Because we have this next war, which hasn't happened yet, means actually a direct war with China. So we have to go to war with Russia. Even though the war with Russia is pushing Russia and China into each other's arms. Don't let that fuck with you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it certainly seems like not bleeding up our own resources and not being at odds with the Russians would make it easier to oppose China. This is their new talking point, is that if we let Russia get away with this, then China will have the balls to go take Taiwan. And I think they also somewhat realized that when China didn't back us up on this one, that maybe China was playing a game of, if the U.S., if this is very costly for the U.S. and Putin is successful because we didn't get their back, then it's going to be harder for anyone to oppose us when we do take Taiwan. But that makes it a strategic error. Like, it was a strategic error from the outset, the same way, like, you know, if Iraq and Iran were natural enemies and you were truly concerned with Iran, it would have made sense to, take out Saddam Hussein if you were truly concerned with Iran. And so in this case, if your real concern was China, then you probably really wanted to be on good terms with Russia. That was a strategic error. And at the moment, you get a lot of people who are dying. So why not just, stop the dying, and then we'll have more resources, and then we'll deal with the China thing. That sounds
which hasn't happened yet, by the way, which is all just speculation.
It sounds like you'd be in a better spot for trying to deal with that.
Go ahead.
Well, that's why Chris Christie is actually on MSNBC and doing his job well of pitching the Ukrainian war.
And you can go
appeal to those old school Republicans.
Isn't it a great like fucking thing where it's like, oh, we have a 2-party system, and yet this guy who's running for the Republican nomination can just go on to MSNBC and say everything they completely agree with. Like, okay, yes, you're right there with the Democrats. Congratulations. Here, let's play the end of this clip.
It's a place that we want to be in from a practical, economic, or technological perspective. And when you look at what's happening here, then go to the Middle East. The Iranians are obviously coordinating with the Russians and the Chinese to provide more sophisticated weaponry to the Russians. And the folks in the Middle East, whether it's the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, are all going to look at this and say, it's not worth it to be friends with the United States anymore. We might as well cut the best deal we can with the Chinese.
Let's pause it right here, because this is what's so right. Yeah, the Iranians are working with the Russians to give them the most sophisticated weapons, because that's where you go for the most sophisticated weapons, is to Iran, as everybody knows. So this whole part, it's like, yeah, but this is all just spin. I mean, can't you obviously look at this from the opposite perspective, where he's like, well, look, the Chinese are working with the Russians. They're funding this war there. The Iranians are coordinating with the Chinese and the Russians, and they're all trying to get more weapons in on Russia's side. And look at all these other players like the Saudis and all these guys who are now, they're kind of open to like, oh, maybe we'll join this community. And it's like, okay, right. But what's the other way to look at that? Is that, oh yeah, our policy of fighting a proxy war against Russia has actually pushed all of these countries to work more closely together. And perhaps our policy over the last, over the last 50 years of just demonizing and doing everything we can to undermine Iran, yeah, that's put them in a position where when some other people are grouping up against America, they're probably going to want to jump in. And perhaps the last 20 years of just catastrophic wars throughout the Middle East have put a lot of Middle Eastern countries in a position to go like, oh yeah, maybe we'll jump over on this side. And perhaps if the Saudis are this willing to drop us, maybe we shouldn't have been propping them up for all of these years. Maybe we shouldn't have given them a war of genocide in Yemen and backed them up and refueled their fighter planes and done all of this stuff for them. Maybe all of that, which you supported, was really bad policy that led to this place. And instead, he takes that and goes, so no, see, this is proof that we must continue this neocon hawkish policy.
That's all it takes. This guy is a corrupt politician, always has, always was, and it's unbelievable that they'll even, and a failed politician at that. I mean, what did he pull, at 2% the last time around? Yeah. And I guess this is the best they got to try and parade the neocon talking points. Well,
they need someone who's going to be a pit bull attacking Donald Trump, and so that's what they got here.
Where does this payday come from? Like, at the end of the day, like, where does he actually, get to write another book on the tail of Donald Trump, and it just gets bought by someone for a shit ton of money? Like, where does the payday actually come from for this shit?
I don't know, but it's coming from somewhere.
Inflation is increasing the supply of money and credit and pushing prices up. So when everybody talks about, and so many do, and they assume everybody knows, cost of living is going up, prices are going up, that is inflation. And it isn't. It's a consequence of inflation. The inflation comes by increasing the supply of money and credit. So we want to make that point, but what do we do about it? There are other fallacies about what's going on in inflation, and Chris has been doing a little bit of investigation. And Chris, what do you have to say about real inflation? What should we do about it?
Yeah, it is the counterfeiting of money by the banking system, not just the Fed. The commercial banks also create money out of thin air. And they do it, as you mentioned, through the loan market, and it's price controls. And I like to give the following example because it's easy to understand how this works. Imagine your local supermarket. You have a bag of chips there. That's the market price is $5 every day you go in and out. Chips are $5. But one day the supermarket suppresses the price down to 25 cents from $5. By the time you find out about that and you get there, the shelf will be empty. People will scoop them up at 25 cents on a bag, and the shelf is empty because the supermarket can't create chips out of thin air. So once the shelf is empty, that's it. They're gone. Well, the same principles apply to interest rates. Let's say the market rate is 7%. That's what the market, can bear at the moment. But the Fed says, no, we're going to fix it at 1%. So again, just as people rush to go get those cheap chips, people rush into the banks to get cheap loans, 1%. But unlike the chips, the banks don't run out of dollar digits. They can create as many digits as they want. So more and more borrowers go, and they're taking all this money, and all this money is being counterfeited into the economy. And people, they spend them on crazy things. Every stupid idea that's uneconomic gets funding at 1% because everything looks good at 1%. So it distorts the economy. It drives up prices because now you have all this new money, and not new goods have been created. And that's how it messes up the entire economy. And this is all from the simple idea that it's legal and okay for the banking system, the Fed and the commercial banks, to counterfeit money.
And if you're worried about prices, you have to deal with the monetary unit, and you have to worry about the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. And the balance sheet is skyrocketing and will continue to, because the government, under circumstances of war, the war is going on in Ukraine, or the leftover funding that was increased to fight the war against the COVID virus. I mean, it was endless spending. But they didn't have the money. They didn't tax people. That would even been worse. But it is a tax, though. When you inflate, it's an invisible tax. So this idea that there's not a whole lot of damage done by just increasing the money and helping people pay their bills, it's a real fallacy. And the one reason why I think they do that, they look at prices, and the different reason prices are going up is that prices, we can regulate them, or they want to regulate them. They'll have price controls, wage controls. They'll do these things to try to control and slow down the economy. But that is not necessary, and it's wrong to have to do that. The economy might be increasing or decreasing, but the market has to adjust it by the people buying and selling and setting interest rates. But the setting of interest rates artificially by the government has done a great deal of harm. It's like federal debt. Oh, the federal debt. Democrats spend too much money. Republicans spend too much on war. They cause the inflation because they spend money. The war, well, psychologically it contributes, but the big thing is where the real inflation comes from is they can't tax the people for all this expensive, so they have to print the money. They have to increase the balance sheet, and just looking at the balance sheet during the COVID lockdown is huge, and the balance sheet is continuing to expand because of the recession that's going on and the different problems we have. So that is not an answer to the problem of just continue to spend money. It's because the spending of the money, the debt, will incentivize the Federal Reserve to do the real evil, and that is promote the system of fractional reserve banking, as well as increasing the balance sheet by taking credit out of thin air because they have the authority to do it, and buy government debt to keep the government alive. It's amazing they get away with it for so long, but they're not getting away with it quite as easily, and it looks like there's signs on the horizons that bad times will come of it.
Yeah, the next fallacy I wanted to bring up, Dr. Paul, was that this inflation creates wealth, that when they create money, they're actually creating new wealth. It's the exact opposite. They are destroying wealth. Because what happens is you have a situation of something for nothing. They create digits by typing on a keyboard in 2 seconds, just add another zero, and you now have this money that you did nothing for. You didn't work for it, you didn't labor, and then you take this newly created money, and then you could go out into the economy and then purchase real goods and services that people are laboring for. So a person could be a farmer, and he's tilling the soil, he's doing the whole thing to finally get vegetables to the market, and here comes this counterfeit money that he's going to be paid in, and there was no work behind it. There's no trade here. What has happened is his money, the farmer's money, has been diluted. So he's been robbed. He did all this work. The person with the counterfeit money did zero, and that's why it's a destroyer of wealth. It destroys the value of the money. And the people that do this, the authoritarians, the government, they use this to their advantage. They create dollars, to propagandize us. They create dollars to send to Ukraine, and we have no say whatsoever. We just read the headlines. Oh, another 10 billion to Ukraine. Okay, we have no say in the matter. So, but this is all funny money that they create. They don't ask us. They don't care what we think, and they do whatever they want.
There's so much pain and suffering when you start saying, we're going to quit giving you your monetary drug of having endless money, because all it does is devalue the currency. Like Chris says, it doesn't create wealth. So the people know, housewives know more about that than the Federal Reserve would admit. Mm-hmm. So this too is coming to an end, the system that we have today. And the biggest fallacy right now, it has to be corrected, is the absence of a definition of the unit of account. And right now, it's just anything and everything. And there's a lot of attempts now to compensate with this by trying to devise another unit of account outside of the dollar arena. And it remains to be seen when that comes. I think it will come, but eventually it will have to deal with the subject of what is the unit of account that we're dealing with. I want to thank everybody today for tuning into the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.